Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to USF today to hear our guest speaker. I'd like to thank a few people, including Valerie Gonzalez, the US film crew, Dean Weber and Dean Veach, Margot Fry, Ilana Berkowitz, and many others who helped to make the event possible. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Casey Mulligan. He obtained his BA from Harvard University and his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He currently is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. Casey has been doing a lot of interesting research in a variety of extremely important areas over the years. This includes research in Social Security and retirement, causes and consequences of policy distortions, voting and public policy, labor markets, human capital and growth. For example, he asked the question, how much better is society that we now live to 78 instead of 48? He's also worked in the mortgage markets. One of Casey's important contributions to our understanding of the economy is his new book called The Redistribution Recession. After the 2008 recession, there was a strong reaction by the government to give large subsidies to the poor and the unemployed. That was important and something we all agree is good. However, Casey asked whether the government aid is really good or creates unintended consequences. For example, if too many unemployment benefits are given to people, could they actually make a decision not to take a job? Could employers decide that it's not in their best interest to hire workers? Our first impression is that a law that creates a minimum wage will help workers who are struggling. But Casey challenges this view. Could it be that the minimum wage actually hurts the very workers it was intended to help? Perhaps Casey's most frightening assertion is that the large recession the U.S. economy has had from 2008 on was worse precisely because the government tried to help. Today, Casey will talk about the extensive research he has done to show how oftentimes a good deed can have undesired consequences. We are very honored to have Dr. Mulligan speak today. Would you please give a warm welcome for Dr. Casey Mulligan.
Okay, I'm going to talk today a little bit about my book, which is actually a couple of years old now, and then some updates to the book that you can't get in print yet. It's really coming from a project, kind of a sequel, so to speak. That's what the Hollywood people would call it. So I begin with the question of why the labor market contracted so much and remains, even today, remains depressed. And the methods that I use really are familiar, pretty simple methods from labor and macroeconomics. What's not familiar are the conclusions. They're pretty surprising, and I would agree with your description. They're politically incorrect conclusions, that's for sure. So that's the good news about today's talk. The bad news about today's talk is because there have been so many really clever theories about what's happened, and the authors of those theories don't really give you guidance as to whether they're going to explain 20% of what happened or 2% or 80%. My talk today has really got to be quantitative. We have to have some numbers. Because I'm going to try to convince you that a few pretty basic forces explain a majority of what happened. It's not just one among many clever theories. So the first chart today is the chart of what happened, what it is I'm trying to explain. These are measures of labor market activity. The two darker ones, gray and black, are measures of employment, two commonly used measures of employment. They're measured on a per capita basis. In fact, the employments are measured as number of employees per 1,000 persons. And these two series track each other very carefully. They both say that the quantity of employment on a per capita basis fell maybe 8% or so and has hardly bounced back. The red one is a measure of an index, and really is an index in the sense that it equals 100 at the beginning. It's an index of total hours worked, counting zeros for people who were not employed for whatever reason, and counting then the number of hours of people who were working. And that fell somewhat more. Hours worked also on a per capita basis. You can see it hit bottom here at around 90, and has only recovered part way again, recovering from 90 to 94, is still closer now to its bottom, or this data is maybe 5 or 6 months old, closer now to its bottom than it is to where we were before all this happened. And this kind of thing, by the way, is unusual. This happens maybe once a century, twice a century, something of that frequency. Okay, so how are we going to answer it? I'm going to try to show you some of the highlights in the book in terms of how I look for an answer and some of the clues that I found. And these are, of course, just highlights. I can't give you all the details. The first things I looked at are productivity and wages. What was going on? The quantity of labor was low, for sure. What was going on with productivity and wages? And what I saw there is that employers appear to be, from their actions, appear to be acting like employees suddenly got more expensive. They weren't acting the way I'd expect them to act. They were lacking customers, and they were getting rid of employees just because they didn't have stuff for them to do. It seemed like a lot of businesses had stuff to be done, but they wanted to do it in a less labor-intensive way for some reason. So that's the first clue. Now, the second clue is, once I see that employers are acting this way, well, what are some of the things that might make labor more expensive? I guess one possibility is the employers are just delusional and the employees really aren't more expensive. But there are actually some objective reasons why labor might be more expensive, and one of those is redistribution. That when we help people who are out of work, that gives people less a reason to work, and employers have to compete with that help. And I'll show you an example of that later. The third thing I did is, since I'm thinking about redistribution, I go out there and measure it. Well, how much should the economy react to the amount of redistribution that we see? This is something economists have studied for years. For each kind of unit or of redistribution or each point on the tax rate, we have estimates, and we've had estimates for a while now, of how that would impact the economy. So then I would trace out the effects of the redistribution we actually saw happening in the economy. And there I found that redistribution is the single largest factor depressing work hours. Put it another way, redistribution by itself, without anything else, would depress labor a large fraction of what we saw. Not all of it, let's say half, maybe a little more than half, you'd expect just from redistribution by itself. And I'm going to show you that part today too. And then the last thing I looked at was, I said, well, redistribution doesn't hit everybody equally. There are some people who have better access to the redistribution by design or by accident of the types of programs that are involved. So if redistribution were really an important force, then the groups of people who had more access to the additional help would be the ones whose behavior is changing more like that red line. And people who didn't have access to the help would have different behavior. So I looked for that as well, and it turns out, perhaps surprisingly, that there are pretty striking differences among groups in terms of both their access to new government programs and their propensity to be out of work or working short hours. And then the last thing I looked at, I'm not sure the crime metaphor is such a great metaphor, but sticking with that metaphor, what's the motive? Okay, if you're going to blame it on redistribution, so to speak, why did we have redistribution? Did it just come from the sky, or did it come from something? And actually, I'm going to start there with my talk today. So what I want to draw here is, I want to focus on the known trade-off between redistribution or equity and efficiency. We've known there's a trade-off. We know that When people can get stuff without working, that gives them less reason to work. The good news is they have help when they're not working, and that's safety or equity. That's the good news, and I'm measuring that on this vertical axis. High up would be good. More safety, more security, more equity in society. But the other thing we might be interested in is labor market efficiency, and there's going to be a trade-off there. And I've drawn it. It's a downward sloping. It really is a trade-off. If you want more of one, you're going to have less of the other. There's really no free lunch in these sort of things. I've also shown two extremes here. At one extreme, you get, sometimes it's called on your own economics. You just tell people you're on your own. No help for you. When something tough happens, too bad. You're on your own. And I call that the self-reliance rate equals 1. That'd be at one extreme. You'd have the maximum efficiency there because people would understand everything they do is about them. They're on their own. But you'd have the minimum equity or safety. And then at the other extreme, maybe you want to call it communism or something, where people have no stake. They're going to get stuff, education, health, food, regardless of whether they work or not. And there the good news is, whether you're working or not, you have a standard of living. The bad news is you have no incentives, and that was one of the challenges with communism. And that's another, and I'd call that an extreme. And the places I've lived, and probably most of you live, are somewhere in here where there's some kind of balance, that we have some efficiency, but we also have some safety. So this is a video. I should tell you a little bit about Mr. Reese before I play his video. His job is a recruiter. Corporations come to him and say, we need some more employees. Go out and find them some for us. Screen them, make sure they're qualified, and bring us those workers. So he's out there talking to workers, talking to businesses that hire. I got this. He testified in Congress, so he's under oath. I don't know if he's a religious man and he cares that he put his hand on the Bible or not, but he was under oath for whatever that's worth. And he's describing some of the consequences of the extra unemployment assistance that was available at the time, 2009, 2010, 2011. He describes some of those consequences that he saw. So I'm going to click on this, and hopefully everybody will be able to hear it.
In late 2009, we began to see hiring returning to the economy. We were hit head-on with a hurdle we didn't anticipate. We had applicants applying for jobs, but only to protect their status for unemployment insurance. We've actually had applicants say that they had done the math and that they were not willing to work for $10 an hour because their unemployment check, coupled with gas savings, lunch, and uniforms, made it more attractive to stay home. The way they saw it, they would be working for $2.50 an hour above what they could get on unemployment, so they'd rather stay home.
So Mr. Reese saw pretty clearly, he's not trained in economics, but he saw pretty clearly that he is competing with these other programs. And that doesn't make the programs wrong, but that's a consequence that people can't do both at the same time. They can't be on the program and be working, and this is an extra competitor that employers had, and it made it harder to get employees. Either they have to pay enough to make people willing to come off the benefits, or they have to somehow convince workers to work or get by with fewer workers. That's the basic trade-off from the businessman's point of view. Now the way to maybe give a political context to all this, part of why I see what's happening, and that's why I'm not willing to go as far as you did and say that these were mistakes or something like that. Part of what I see is happening is a changing will of the people. That we had a balance in the 70s and 80s and 90s between efficiency and security, or efficiency and safety. There was a balance there, and people wanted to adjust that balance. It wasn't a unanimous vote or anything, but there tend to be moves in the direction of people saying, you know what, let's give up some efficiency and have more safety and more help for people. The first event that I see is the Republicans losing their majority in the Senate. And I see that as perhaps as an event because often the parties are aligned so that the Democrats put a little more weight on security and safety and less weight on efficiency, and the Republicans maybe the other way around. And they started to lose their seats in Congress. The Farm Bill. Farm Bill has a lot of things in it, but really the major part of the farm bills, including the 2002 Farm Bill, is an assistance program for people whose incomes are temporarily low, the food stamp program. And that expanded and paved the way for further expansions in the program. Of course, in 2008, Democrats had won the trifecta there, meaning the people said we want Democrats in the House, and we want Democrats in the Senate, and we want Democrats in the White House. I view that as if I'm going to listen to the people and say they maybe want something different than what they had. And then you had economic events as well, not just political events. Health care is a concern for people, and getting sick can be a random event, an unexpected event, an unwelcome event for sure. And getting the treatment for health has been getting more and more expensive. Treatments have been getting better and better. That's the good news, but they've been getting more and more expensive. And that kind of was starting to change, I think, how people look at security versus efficiency. 2008, some scary stuff happened in marketplaces. Stock market, bond markets, repo markets, things like that. That might have also caused people to reassess how they want to balance these things. And then last but not least, there's been a steady gap growing between rich and poor, and that may affect some of these trade-offs too. So in a sense, another way to look at this is the puzzle is not why we have so much redistribution now. It's why do we have all those years with so little redistribution? And when I say so little, maybe compared to Western Europe. It's been a puzzle economists have tossed around. Well, why do we have so much less redistribution in Western Europe? Well, the puzzle's solved because it's not true anymore. Maybe we finally learned that the Europeans have some interesting ideas there where they have more safety and less efficiency. And then the last thing, and maybe there's some of this going on too. Maybe there's some economic misunderstandings here. Maybe there's too much of our society, too many of the voters, too many of the journalists don't understand or forgot that there's not a free lunch here. There is a trade-off. That we're going to pay a price for this extra security, and it's going to be a smaller labor market. Maybe that's a role too. This is not my necessarily expertise in keeping track of what people understand, but maybe that's a factor. So just to recap, my model, at a highest level, my model is what happens. We had one kind of balance before the recession between efficiency and equity, and today we've gone in a direction of more of one and less of the other. Okay, this table's hard to read, and that's the intention. This is a list of the statutes, federal laws, that introduced or expanded safety net programs. And I don't expect you to read the little letters yet. First thing I want you to notice, there's lots of different statutes here. There wasn't just one law. It wasn't just the Affordable Care Act or something like that. There were a number of laws. I also want to show you how I have it organized. On the top, I have unemployment and related programs. So these are programs for people who were laid off from their jobs. In the middle, I have the SNAP program. Used to be called the food stamp program. Actually, one of these laws changed the name to SNAP, stands for, I think, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And on the bottom, I make it look little, and it doesn't get a big treatment in the book, our health care programs, especially the Medicaid program. So that's the organization vertically. Horizontally, I have two columns here. Maybe you can see that. The left column has to do with laws that change rules for eligibility. By that I mean changing the rules for who can be in the program and get benefits. All these programs have benefits. Not everyone in America can get food stamps. Not everyone in America can get Medicaid or unemployment assistance. You have to fulfill certain criteria. And these are laws that change those criteria and expanded them and allow additional groups of people in the program who were never allowed in before. And in the right-hand column are statutes that change the benefit rules, putting aside who's in the program, how much are we going to pay them, or how large a benefit are we going to give them. And the laws change in that direction too, making the benefits larger and more generous for the people in. So I'm going to zoom in here so you can start to read it. I'm going to zoom in on the unemployment part here. So again, we see the two different columns, eligibility and benefits. I'm going to indicate in red here the parts you probably heard of. There's been lots of newspaper, lots of TV, lots of websites talking about the now really infamous 99 weeks of unemployment insurance that people could get. That after being laid off, people could get 99 weekly checks to help them with their expenses during that period. There were actually 4 different statutes that created those 99 weeks. It used to be before 2007, it was only 26 weeks. After 26 weeks of assistance, you were basically cut off. Whether you found work or not, regardless of how things were going with you, you were cut off. And these laws allowed you to go up to 99 weeks until you were cut off. And that's a factor, and that's an expansion of the eligibility of the program. You're telling people, look, those of you who have been out a week work more than a half a year, we're letting you in the program now. So that's expanding the eligibility. I don't want to trivialize that, but you already heard about it. And what I want to point out is that's not the only change in the unemployment program. There's laws here that don't have red boxes. It's not even the only change in eligibility for the unemployment program. There were other changes in eligibility that had nothing to do with how many weeks. They had more to do with how attached you are to the labor market. The old program had some fairly strict rules. You had to have a pretty serious job in the sense that you showed up week in, week out for an extended period of time before you could qualify for the program. And that was relaxed. Now people can get unemployment assistance who have a rather weak attachment. Maybe they're in for a few months and then they're out and they're in, and they're allowed in the program. Again, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but that's a change. That's a new rule. There are people in the program now who wouldn't have been allowed in the program under the old rules. And on the right, we have benefits. There were a number of changes in benefits that were paid. When you're unemployed, you got paid more in 2009 and 2010 than unemployed people got paid in prior years. Some of it was just outright cash. There was a bonus put on there. Real big one, and actually relevant for what's going on in the labor market today, is you got health assistance. When you were fired from your job during this time frame, 2009 and 2010, how should I put it? If you liked your employer's health plan after you got fired, you could keep it. And the government would pay 2/3 of the cost. If you're unlucky to be fired in 2007 or 2002 or something like that, that help wasn't there. You had to pay full price for your health care after being unemployed. With after-tax dollars, pretty expensive proposition to carry health insurance as an unemployed person before these laws came along. And this law came along and said, no, it's not going to be that tough anymore. We're going to give you help. Again, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but it's different. There's more help while these laws are in effect than when there weren't. And we can't expect really to have, as Mr. Reese explained, we can't expect to have business as usual when these programs aren't doing business as usual. And then there's the SNAP program, also changes in both eligibility and the amount of the benefit. What's a little bit interesting about some of the SNAP changes is they were done at a state level. Really, federal laws empowered states to expand their programs. And the big thing that states did, once the feds allowed them to do this, they stopped checking people's assets. Food stamps traditionally if you had a few $1,000s in the bank, you had some equity in your car, you weren't allowed in the program. Basically, the program said, look, you have some money, go spend it, and then when you run out, come back. They didn't do that anymore. All you had to do basically was have low income, and being unemployed is a pretty effective way of having low income. So unemployed people could get out of the program, especially unmarried unemployed people. Food stamp program is based on household income. So if you're unemployed but you had a spouse who basically earns even just a little bit more than minimum wage, your income wouldn't be low enough to get on this program. So this is one of these programs that expands for specific groups of people, namely unmarried people. Now all that stuff seems complicated. We had all those laws, all these provisions, benefits, eligibility, timing. You know, how can you think about all that, or can you, or do you have to study every law at a time? And my conclusion is, no, we can understand the whole package, or begin to understand the whole package, by thinking about one basic economic quantity, and that is, it's a subtraction. It's a difference between how much help are you getting when you're not working from whatever programs you may or may not participate in, minus how much help are you getting while you're working, which may be zero because you're working, but anyway, that difference. And what I did is I calculated that difference for every month based on the rules that were in place. And then what these graphs show you, especially, let's talk at the top lines. The top line is kind of the bottom line, but the top line is showing us, measured in dollars per month, how much extra assistance people out of work get versus people who work get, on average. Of course, there are many situations, like there are unmarried people who have a different situation than married people, but this is an overall average. And you can see the red line jumps up. And basically, these jumps occur because there were new rules. The unemployment program eligibility got expanded, or the food stamp program eligibility got expanded, or the food stamp benefit went up. And there are also some jumps in a downward direction as some of these programs expired. Right here we also have a payroll tax cut. Payroll taxes are something that workers pay, non-workers don't. So when you have a cut in the tax, that's something that workers get, but non-workers don't get. So that's all counted in here. And then what I did is instead of measuring in dollars per month, I measured it as a percentage of compensation that kind of a middle earner gets, technically a median earner. So these are percentages. It's the same series we can measure on either on the left or on the right. And so that's telling us, I think of it as kind of a tax rate on work, saying as a share of compensation before the recession, when you lost your job, on average, 40% of what you were earning in that job, you get back in terms of help, either paying less tax or receiving additional benefits. At the peak of the stimulus, really, during 2009 and 2010, that was up to 48%. The help you get was 48% of your compensation instead of 40%. You can look at it the other way around too. What's the reward to working? Well, before it used to be, when you worked, you got 60% of the benefit. 40% of the benefit you get even without working, but 60% you get only because you worked. And that reward went down from 60 to 52. 52 would be 100 minus 48. So either way you want to look at it, the help went up or the reward to working went down. This, what I want to do is to take this 8-point increase, or measured in dollars a month, it's about $320 a month, and I want to show you the different programs it came from. And that's the next chart. So the total here is $310 or $320 a month, or 8 points on that tax rate. And each shaded area is a different program. Now the biggest, if you had to look at only one parameter of one program, I'd recommend looking at the biggest one, and that's this one. And that's those different statutes that increase the UI duration. That's the 99 weeks. So in a sense, the journalists and everybody were paying attention to 99 weeks. That's good. They were paying attention to the single biggest thing. I don't know why we're restricted to only think about one thing, but if you only want to think about one thing, that's the single biggest thing. The bad news is that's only about a third of the whole. So if you're thinking about how 99 weeks of unemployment insurance affect the labor market, you're only seeing about a third of the picture. There's another 2/3 out there to be seen. SNAP is another contributor. That health assurance assistance is another contributor, and so on. I've shown all the pieces there. So that's kind of one mistake that I think was made. It's too much focus on the 99 weeks. It's not that it's irrelevant, but it's not the only thing. You're kind of seeing, I'm exaggerating a little, but you're kind of only seeing the tip of the iceberg when you look at that. There's a whole iceberg underneath. The other mistake that I think's been made, so in focusing on that 99 weeks, is just think about, well, when we allow people to have assistance for so long, aren't they going to be slow to go back to work? And that's what Mr. Reese was kind of talking about. And that's a factor. I'm not going to ignore that. But that's not the only effect of unemployment insurance. Remember, the point of unemployment insurance is to make make a layoff less painful. That's the point, right? Is there any other point to it than that? But if you make something less painful, people are going to do less to avoid it. Layoffs are painful. People cry when they get fired, okay? That's a painful experience. People take steps to avoid that. Businesses take steps to avoid that. Maybe they cut their prices, maybe they rearrange their business somehow to keep those jobs, put people to part-time instead of firing them. There are steps that can be taken. I'm not saying that layoffs are completely unavoidable, but there's discretion there that both workers and employers have. And when you make it less painful, people are going to take less actions to avoid that painful situation. An example I like to give, although it brings up some bad memories for me, but drowning. I've never drowned in my life, so I can't speak to it firsthand, but it's close. I remember once I pulled my 2-year-old son out of a pool, and he was in the process of drowning. He's still here. He's a big boy now, but I pulled him out, and I remember the terror on his face, so it had to be pretty scary. But I'll admit, I've never done the drowning thing myself. And there are government programs that are designed to prevent people from drowning, like the Coast Guard. That's what the Coast Guard's there for, to save people on the water. The Coast Guard not only admits, but they totally understand. They actually contacted me and they said, you know what? We know that our presence causes people to take more risks on the water. We know that. And she said, the commander from Michigan, Coast Guard Sector Michigan, told me, I'll be glad to send you the data and show. Up in Alaska, where we can't really help people, the distances are just too great and the water's too cold, people take care of themselves. They got the life jackets, they got the radios, they don't take risks. But in New England, where the nearest Coast Guard station is always about 5 miles away, people are doing crazy stuff. And that happens on our labor market. That being fired is terrifying, yes, but so is drowning. Yet people do things to put themselves at risk of drowning according to how much help is going to be there when they're flailing in the water. And it's the same thing happens. And that effect's been totally ignored. I don't understand why, because it's basic economics, but even if there were no effect that Mr. Reese talked about of people taking longer to go back to work, there would still be effect on employment through layoffs. Unemployment assistance and all these programs, they subsidize layoffs. They make layoffs less painful. You're going to get more layoffs than you would have had otherwise. So that's why I really say you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg when you're looking at this piece of the 99 weeks. You're missing the other pieces, and you're really missing the other effects. Okay, so we had extra assistance for people. For better or for worse, there's extra assistance. You might measure that extra assistance in terms of, as I did, percentage points on the tax rate. Instead of 40% tax rate, we had a 48% tax rate on average. So what's the effect of that? When you raise the tax on work, you're going to get less work. But how much less work? So let me show you what I didn't do first. So here's my tax rate measure, the same red line. This is measured now in dollars per year instead of dollars per month. It's just different by a factor of 12. And the black line is the economy, the labor market. It's the hours per work series that I showed you first slide today, flipped upside down. It's hours not at work. And you can see they kind of closely follow each other. Now, before you call the causality police with your cell phone, I did not look at these and say, aha, the red line caused a recession. But it's worth looking at. Luckily, we have the legacy from lots of labor economics research and tax research in the past, even before 2007, that were trying to get at the causal question of what is the effect of each unit of red line on each unit of black line. We had estimates of that. Now, we argue, we don't agree. It's not like the speed of light where we agree on many, many decimal places. There's room for disagreement. You can't say zero, but there's no way in 2007 you can say, research has shown that taxes have no effect on work. You can't say that. We can argue about the magnitudes, but zero is not one of them. So we have kind of a range of estimates of the effect of how much the black line would move for each unit change in the red line. And that's what I use. Basically, I put it in a supply and demand framework. This is supply and demand, of course, because we got upward sloping lines and downward sloping lines. But we have quantity here vertically, measuring quantities in logs, but it's quantity vertically. And something like a price, wages in the labor market or productivity is measured vertically. So we have a quantity and a price. The benchmark here, the origin, if you will, is where the labor market was before the recession, the last quarter before the recession, 2007 Q4. And we could put any of the data on here. I've only shown you one other data point here, and that's 2009 Q4. And then I put on a demand curve in here. I actually draw the demand curve a little bit higher than it was. It's not going through the origin. It's a little bit higher. And the reason for that is there was some, although slow, some additional productivity growth, capital accumulation that slightly increased the demand for labor. The important part here is the supply curve. And this supply curve really embodies all that prior research. The prior research on the causal effect of taxes on work behavior is embodied in the slope here. And I've drawn a particular slope here of 1. I'll show you other slopes in a minute. This is the supply curve before the recession. And then I've made a couple of adjustments. Number one, population grew after 2007, continued to grow about 1% a year. So that shifted out. When you have more people, you have more supply. People graduating from college or high school or whatever, you're going in the labor market. Also, people's living standards fell. Their consumer spending fell. That's I view as a wealth effect. That by itself makes want people to work more. So that's another shift out. So there was a shift out in the supply curve. But there's also a shift up, and that has come from the safety net expansions. And the shift up is just measured exactly from those tax rates I showed you. And so that we have a shift up. And so the model I have predicts that, well, this is what should, if all that happened was population growth and a wealth effect and the safety net expansion, here's what would have happened with these slopes. Here's what would happen to the labor market. It would have shrank by 6% or so. Now, in fact, it shrank 8%. So you might say the model explained 3/4, 6/8 of what happened. That's the type of exercise I did in the book. Here's another way, look at the same data really. These are two measures of wages. One of the measures, the black one we had already seen on the previous diagram, that productivity had increased a little bit, and we're seeing that here in the black series. I look at the black series and say, you know what, employer costs went up. By employer costs, I mean the wage expense to employers of having employees. Employer costs went up a little bit. Other people look at this and say, well, no, it didn't really go up. Okay, I'm not going to argue that. But look at the red one. The red one plunges. The black one barely moves on the scale of what happened to the red one. The red one is the employee reward to working. And that plunges, and that's because the programs expanded and there were more things that people could get without working than there used to be. And so the after-tax you could call this the after-tax wage or the employee reward to working, fell more than 10%, 12% at its depths, and still remains, as of about a year ago, was still quite low. And if I updated this for you, it'd actually be even lower now. And I really don't see, as an economist, how you'd ever want to ignore the fact that the reward to work is nothing like it used to be. How could the labor market go back to what it used to be without the reward to work going back to what it used to be? I don't see how it could happen. The only way you could ever entertain that fantasy was to think that, the reward to work doesn't matter. That's the only way to do it. And as an economist, I can't do that. I can't say that people ignore the rewards to their actions. So, to conclude this part of it, the safety net expanded suddenly and significantly. And only a part of that has to do with the infamous 99 weeks. The reward to work fell suddenly and significantly. Actually, another measure I have in the book is the number, how many people, because of these new laws, could earn more by not working than by working. 4 million. Now, of course, our country is 300 million people. But 4 million is a lot. On the scale of the number of unemployed people, that's a lot of people who could earn more by not working. These are people even in more extreme situation than Mr. Reese described. Mr. Reese described people who were losing $2 an hour by not working. These are people who lose nothing by not working. And as a result, I think it can explain not all, but a large fraction of what happened in our labor market. So let me give a little update if we have 5 more minutes. A little update. The next big labor market event is the Affordable Care Act. I mean, the law was passed in 2010, but the additional assistance that it is extending to people has really only gone into effect, last month. And there's a couple aspects to this. There's employer penalties. Those haven't come into effect yet. And those can be as much as $4,500 per employee per year. Employees get subsidies. Actually, it's very much like that COBRA subsidy in the Recovery Act. When you're working, you're supposed to pay for your own insurance. When you're out of work, Obamacare is going to be there to help you. That's not something we've ever had before, other than during the Recovery Act. So we're in a new era now. When you lose your job, you're going to get significant amounts of help. Some families will find when they lose their job, they're going to get $15,000 worth of help in terms of paying for their health insurance. Okay, so let me just show you this chart here. In the book stops about here. Depends on the chapter, but the book stops about here. Covers these kind of 5 or 6 years. So we saw this is the Recovery Act already. This is the payroll tax cut expiring, and there's some parts of the food stamp program expiring. A lot of the food stamp program is going to go on forever, but parts of it expired. The big jumps here are the Affordable Care Act. Part of it went in already. Today we're like right here. Part of it is coming in next year. Now they just changed their story about how much is going to come in next year. The employer penalties are actually phased in over a 2-year period. So there'll be, if I were to update this, it'd jump a little next year and then up to the full amount in the year after. So that's that part. You notice I have 2 series here. And this depends on what's going to happen to one of these unemployment programs, the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program. It actually expired at the end of December, but they're trying to revive it. In fact, I kind of suspect they're going to have a deal where they're going to get rid of the individual mandate on the ACA and allow this program to come back. So if the program comes back, our tax rate series will be the solid red line. If the program stays gone, then we'll have the dotted one. So the difference between those two is the EUC program. So either way you look at it, tax rates are a lot higher than they really ever were. And I don't see how the labor market can ever go back to here until the tax rate goes back to here. And doesn't mean we should go back here. Maybe these aren't the good old days. But I find it a little odd that the expectation that the labor market's eventually going to recover on its own, so to speak, and get back to where we were. It can't do that until these incentives go back to where they were, or there's some other force that can totally override these incentives, which I don't quite see what that force would be either. So, good news for me, another book. Good news for the people who benefit. I guess bad news for people who pay for these programs. So, thank you. I welcome your questions and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Casey. Some of my questions are all over the place. One of the things you mentioned at the end was the Affordable Care Act. And from what I saw up there, it looks like we're going to even have higher tax, even more higher unemployment, or even more reduced labor force participation. So do you fundamentally believe that this Obamacare, or this Affordable Care Act, the negatives outweigh the positive? And let me add to that, or is it an inevitable consequence of the developing nature of a nation? You were mentioning that we're now like Western Europe.
Is Europe more advanced than us or less advanced? I don't know. I definitely don't want to ride in their cars, but maybe the rest they got right. You know, I'm not a biologist or a doctor. On the health side, you know, if the law cured cancer, it would be worth trillions. I don't know if it's going to do that. It's not my area. I do know that the labor market's going to bear a burden from this law. And for sure, I know that if you're going to do a cost-benefit analysis of that law, you can't ignore the costs and the labor market costs. White House does it, but that's not the right way to do a cost-benefit analysis.
Well, that leads to my next question. So typically, senators, politicians are somewhat more populist in nature, and they ignore these side effects that you're mentioning. How do you think economists can get the message that this has to also be considered?
I'm expert on the economy, not the economists, but I do get a little distressed when economists who are trained, sometimes at MIT, and they don't point out that there are trade-offs, and they act like there's a free lunch. And they say that the Affordable Care Act is going to make the economy bigger and healthier. I mean, it's not a free lunch. And so at least we could refrain from that, the do no harm type of idea. I don't know if there's something active we could do as well. I don't know.
Do you want to mention any names?
No.
What is one of the government policies today that worries you the most? And what is one that you've seen that actually has done little damage?
Well, actually, until Lehman failed, I was not a business cycle guy. I was interested in democracy, really competition, and the political market. And the concerns I really have are maybe deeper than any kind of recession or whatever. I don't take democracy for granted. All producers want a monopoly. I'd love to have a monopoly on talking about the recession, right? If I could somehow block people from talking about it, and all only had to listen to me, that'd be great. Or everyone had to go to the University of Chicago to get their diploma. And politicians are going to be just the same, that they want to have their office without people competing with them. And how can we ensure that we have that kind of competition when they make the rules? I don't take it for granted. I'm not sure 50 years from now we're going to have a democracy. I don't know, because it's this natural tendency of the producers to monopolize. And we already kind of see it in a way. We only have two parties. Most of us don't like either. It's not true with cell phones or automobiles and other things like that. We have a lot of choices, and we don't have so many choices. And I'm not sure how that's going to work out. I think economists have something to say about it. I think it has to do with technology. I think it has to do with education. So we're equipped to kind of deal with those issues. And I hope we can convince our fellow citizens, not to take democracy for granted, and they have to kind of be vigilant on those sort of issues.
Are you okay with them going to MIT? So my last question, then we'll get it to the audience, is what do you think about the income distribution, which is not really what you're focused on, but that has also changed? And do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's one of the factors. An example I give, I told you my son, I got 5 kids. You got time to hear stories about all of them? I give the story about my daughter. She's 3, okay? She has no incentive to do anything because no matter what happens, she's going to be fed, she's going to be taken care of. But I think that's okay. She's not very productive. I mean, what could she produce, right? Maybe in some societies they got the 3-year-olds being productive, but and so it's kind of natural. If it happens in a family, it's kind of natural that the least productive people would be not working but still living a decent life. And so I think as there have been groups of people who, for at least in terms of what the market values what they do, has gone down, there's some kind of natural result that they wouldn't work and they would be assisted. So I'm not surprised. In fact, I view it more as a puzzle. How did we have all these years of the poor getting poorer, yet the programs didn't expand until recently? That's a little oversimplification. The Medicaid program's been expanding for decades. But aside from that, the puzzle, like I said, is why weren't we Western Europe really at an earlier date?
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to the floor here.
Okay. Well, the argument for these unemployment benefit often goes along the lines like, well, this is going to help the economy because if we spend this money on people, they all spend it. And therefore, it will actually help the economy to grow again. So I'd like you to comment on that. That's one thing. The other thing is, and it relates to the Affordable Care Act. And they have the argument of, let's say, someone like Nancy Pelosi goes, well, people are locked into jobs. There's very little mobility because they're afraid they're losing their health insurance. Now this frees them up. And this additional mobility, that's really going to help the economy. Anyway, I would like to comment on just these 2 gems.
Those are gems. So should I take that right now?
Yes.
Okay, first point, yeah, that there's no trade-off, that you can help unemployed people and make the labor market more efficient. And that's, first let's start with the evidence. Where is the study that shows that paying people not to work actually causes more people to work? Where's that study? Take a look at Krugman's book, which I've read from cover to cover and all the footnotes. He doesn't have any such study. He points to studies of military spending that put people to work. But that's very different. There you're paying somebody to build an airplane, not somebody to stay home and not build an airplane. So we don't have an empirical evidence on that. And the theory, as you described it, I know you didn't believe the theory, but you were trying to recite it for us. The theory is also wrong. That, well, what's right about what you said? Unemployed people don't spend their money the same way as other people do. That's true. Studies have shown that. But not spending it the same way is different than spending. You got to get the funds from somewhere. The government's got to go out and borrow the money or tax somebody. Either way, the guy who's providing the funds for the unemployment program, he can't spend it on a luxury hotel or whatever. And maybe we don't care that he's not spending it, but we got to account for his lack of spending as well. And the net effect, I think, is clear. There's less total spending. Because one thing that people do when they remain out of work is they tighten their belt. And so you allow them to remain out of work longer, or you give them less reason to avoid a layoff in the first place. You're going to have more people with tight belts and less spending. So the result of the unemployment insurance program is less spending in aggregate. Doesn't make it bad or whatever, but it's less spending and more assistance. I mean, that's more safety for people and what have you. Now, the second question was about people being locked into their jobs. I kind of think about things in two dimensions. One is, are they working or not? That's a lot of what we talked about today. And the other dimension is, what is the type of work that they do? It should be a different issue. Now, I see the job lock story that you talked about. It has something to say about the type of work that people do. And maybe the Affordable Care Act will make workers more productive, perhaps. Not sure. I have reason to disagree with that, but let's, for the sake of argument, say that's true. That's different than saying whether they're called them to work more or not. That argument also says they're going to work less. Okay? And for the purposes of just understanding what's going to happen to the unemployment rate in the future, we got to say they're going to work less. Now, is that good or bad? If you're kind of starting out in a situation where the only problem in the economy was job lock, and you got rid of job lock and that caused people to work less, that'd be good. We were kind of working too much before. But as we saw in my graph, we had taxes before the recession. You don't need my graph to know that. We have sales taxes, we had payroll taxes, we had income taxes. You name the tax, we got it. And all that caused people to work too little. And so job lock, in a sense, was on the margin of working, not working, which is actually helping. It was helping to counteract all the reasons not to work. And that gets ignored. I'm not sure why it gets ignored, because we economists know about taxes and their long-standing presence in our economy. So pretty much anything that causes people to work less is reducing our efficiency, at least in that dimension. And it better make up with it for that by increasing efficiency in some other dimension, maybe by getting people to work more effectively, which would be kind of the first effect.
Another question? Please talk into the microphone.
Towards the end in the graph you showed us, you made the assertion that the labor market can't return to where it was before the recession until we decrease the income taxes. Would you say decreasing the income taxes is more of a priority than cutting back on the unemployment insurance programs, or is it the other way around?
When I say taxes, I mean it in a comprehensive sense. All the things that workers have to pay for that non-workers don't. So actually, most of the action in the red lines I showed you today were all in the, politicians would call them spending, not taxes. And it kind of doesn't matter all that much how you get the reward to work back to what it used to be. It could be by cutting unemployment, could be by cutting some other tax. Wouldn't matter so much, but something has to increase the reward to working if you want people to work the way they used to. Now maybe we shouldn't go back to that. That's a different question. But
Hi, thanks for coming. My question has to do with the trade-off between the safety net and the efficiency. And you made me think of Western Europe. You said it yourself. And I think there's lots of examples in Western Europe that one could point to that corroborate. I might be jumping here to a conclusion that you're not making, but that corroborate that the natural rate of unemployment is higher in countries that have a larger safety net. But then often students will point out to me the exceptions among those Western European countries that where you still have a low natural rate, it seems like, and they would say that the safety net is larger there than it is here. And I'm wondering, it's probably beyond the scope of your book, but have you thought much about Western Europe and the examples that it gives?
I hate to be excessively gringo focused. In my career, I hadn't done that until lately, but America's kept me plenty busy the last few years. But one thing I'd caution in making those kind of comparisons, I didn't show you anything in the unemployment rate, and there was a reason for that. I showed you the employment rate. Because as an economist, I can understand a little better what it means. You're working or you're not. That's a fairly bright line. Whereas unemployment is a type of not working, number one. And it has to do with state of mind. I'm not trivializing people's state of mind, but it has to do with state of mind, which I'm less of an expert on. Number one. Number two, the rewards for saying you have a certain state of mind, namely saying I'm looking for work, have changed over time. They've gone up and they've gone down, and that causes changes in that number that aren't real economic changes. And the same would be true across countries. Some countries may have programs for anyone who's not working, people who are out sick versus people who are out unemployed or whatever. Other countries may be focused on the unemployed, and you have to account for that kind of stuff. So I tend to look at hours worked per person. Prescott had a famous paper on making that type of comparison. And I think what people agree with, Prescott says it's all taxes. Other people say, no, it's labor market regulations. But there seems to be wide agreement. There's labor market distortions result in Western Europe having lower hours worked than us. In the past, I mean, we're more on their league these days.
I have a question for you then. Your presentation suggests that the generosity of the program rules for unemployment are hurting the economy overall. Would you suggest that we get rid of them altogether, or is there a level that you would consider healthy?
Well, no, they're making it less efficient. They're making labor market smaller, to be very concrete. They're making labor market smaller. That may be a price worth paying for having more assistance, safety, security for people. That's the trade-off I talked about. We maybe moved along that trade-off. As an economist, I can't question moving along the trade-off any more than I can question somebody eating more chocolate ice cream and less strawberry ice cream, and they're both good things. I can't argue with that. The only thing I can argue with is saying that, look, there's no trade-off. You can have all of everything, and that's just not right.
I was wondering if you could comment on which parts of the economy have shrunk in terms of that labor market. Is it particular sectors, or is it, IT or service industry? And I'm curious if you had any thoughts around the push-pull factors from Latin America. So people coming to the U.S. to work because they're looking for work, and they're typically not documented, therefore they're not getting any of these benefits, and they're willing to work, and how that kind of plays on all of this as well.
I don't know if you have any undergrads or grad students who want looking for a paper topic, but looking at the work behavior of the immigrants over this time period would be interesting, because again, they have different access. The little teeny bits that I've seen on that has been that the labor market for immigrants bounced back much more quickly. It's maybe bounced back all the way already. I'm not an expert on an area. There's special measurement issues there and everything, but that's a great thing to look at. There's another group that has less access I mentioned in my talk, and so you asked what areas of the economy. Married people. Married people, their hours went down a lot less. Married people's hours changed less. Their unemployment doesn't last nearly as long. And I think there's a reason for that, which is they don't have access to a lot of these expansions. They don't have access to food stamps, as I mentioned. They don't have access to Medicaid. And even the insurance subsidy I mentioned, which was quite generous, most married people didn't have access to that either, because that law required you look to your spouse for your health coverage before you look to the government. So married people were getting a lot less help, and their labor market bounced back a lot more quickly. It never shrank as much in the first place. Now maybe you're saying there's a different demand for married workers or something like that. Then maybe we should get into the business of renting out wedding rings people to take on interviews. If that's such a big deal. I think the real issue is they have a different set of incentives. They have a kind of security from their spouse that doesn't have some of these trade-offs as severely that Mr. Reese mentioned. Your spouse can look at you and say, look, you're able to work. Don't just free ride off of me. Take that job or whatever. And that's made a difference. That also works out by schooling group. There's actually interactions as well. You look at people with low schooling but who are married, their labor market didn't shrink nearly as much as people who are unmarried who have lots of schooling, which is kind of an odd thing, but it makes perfect sense in this type of framework.
Any more questions?
Good.
So, as an economist, I'm sure you pay attention to the social aspect of things, not just quantitative things, but also the social aspect. So, from that point of view, where can we find a medium for incentive and for efficiency, and while still having a safety net, and still making sure that we grow as an economy to compete on a world scale? From like a purely social aspect.
Okay, but economics is not the Olympics, so we can grow and compete and keep what we have. It'll be at a lower level. So what I showed you there was levels, the fraction of the population that's at work. We can stick with that lower fraction, but have it continue to grow with the population, and what have you. Now, I don't quite take that to the finish line in the sense that every country has what it's good at. Maybe Italy's good at olive oil or something like that. What was America good at? They had a more flexible labor market. And we were able to entertain industries that really relied on that more. In a place like Sweden or France, they tend to rely on industries that didn't need that flexibility. So I think we lose some of our competitive advantage by not being the place of freedom in the world anymore. One of the problems with acting like Western Europe is we'll never be as Western European as Western Europeans are. And it would be good to have kind of our own niche. But with that caveat, I'd say, we can grow, we can compete, just at a lower level, which still may be the richest in the world, but at a lower level.
I think is the last question.
If we hit like a double dip recession, that last graph you showed, the Affordable Care Act, can you kind of speak to how that graph would change if we hit a double dip recession?
I would expect we'll have a double dip. Until last month, there was only one peak on the tax rate. So I was saying all along, back in 2009, people were worried, is there going to be a double dip? I said, no, there's only one peak on the tax rate. You're only going to have one bottom. But now we got a new law in place, and it's cleared all its obstacles, the Supreme Court and the presidential election. And the new law says now we're going to have two peaks on the tax rate, a second peak. Well, you're going to have a second dip. The only way you could kind of get around that is if this peak were phased in over a long enough period of time that it wasn't noticeable as a peak per se. And that may happen with some of the delays and everything, but other than that, I would think there'd be the labor market will go down before it goes up. Measured the way I did, hours worked per person or employment per person.
Any last questions? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.